Hi everyone! So in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to paint a chocolate Labrador in acrylics, and this is going to have lots of tips and techniques on how to capture this type of fur colour. Now what I like to do to start with is I always like to get the eye in first, and then I will work on the fur around it. Now the reason being, obviously the eyes are the soul, the main expression of that animal, so I do want to make sure that I've got that right before I move on to the fur around it. Now, the first thing that I want to mention is, regardless of any animal that we're painting, the initial stages never look great. We have to get past that. The first initial blocking in stage here is purely just to really get rid of that background colour. Now, I like to use Liquitex Basics, and they are a little bit more transparent compared to other brands, but I like that because I work so much with glazes, and you're going to see this throughout this tutorial. But because they can be a little bit more on the transparent side, that first layer can look a little bit more, a little bit more terrible really, because it does show a lot more of that background through. However, as you can see, once you put that second layer of paint on top, it has completely got rid of that, and it really does start to smooth itself out. Now, in order to get this type of fur, it is all in the layering process. This is really important, and you can see that I'm using a range of different brushes. I will use usually some filberts for my first base layers, and then I'll start to work with more of my detailed brushes when it comes to the fur details. So in between those layers there, you saw what looked like a really bright brown layer. Now that is my first glaze, and because I like working in small sections, I will work with glazes throughout my painting process. I will put my first 2 or 3 layers down as I am here, so this will be my first. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm then tweaking the details of the other sections of the painting. I never waste any of that time. This is now the second layer, and look how much that background now has completely gone. Again, I'm waiting for that to dry. I've done another glaze, and now I can start going in and adding some details over the ear. It's really important to make sure that you study 3 main things when painting fur. It's the fur direction, the fur length, and the fur thickness. So those 3 things are going to massively affect the type of texture of that fur that we end up with. So for something like this with a chocolate Labrador, you want to keep your brush strokes fairly short. You don't want each brush stroke to be particularly thick, so therefore you want to be working with lighter pressure. Now the fur direction is going to change depending on the reference photo, the structure of that dog, the way that it is built. The fur in the direction of that fur is never random. It will always follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So the way that we have to curve those brush strokes is really important, because if we don't get that accurate, we will change the face shape, and obviously then the finished painting will not resemble that pet. Now this was not a pet portrait that I was asked to do. I created this for a Patreon tutorial, and the entire real-time tutorial from start to finish, no parts sped up or cut out, are up there now. All of it is live. So if you are interested in this real-time tutorial, then I will link my Patreon in the description below. If that is of interest, I do also have a Patreon library on my website, which lists all of the tutorials that are available on Patreon before you sign up, so you can get an idea of whether or not the content I've got there is for you. Now the wonderful thing about Patreon is you can stay for as long as you want, or you can cancel at any time. It is really flexible. So as I say, if that is of interest, any of my other slower tutorials, then I'll link my Patreon and my Patreon library in the description below. So as I've carried on building on these layers here, you can see again I'm working with more glazes. I'm really paying attention to those 3 things I've just mentioned, and predominantly now you can see the importance of the fur direction. So as I start building up my details here, it's very clear now the sort of structure of this animal's face. I also would recommend to use a variety of brushes, and I've briefly mentioned this at the beginning of the tutorial. If we work with one brush from the first layer up to our final layers, all of the details, the fur texture will look the same, and you could potentially end up with a painting that's a little bit flatter. And one thing that I talk so much about in all of my in-depth tutorials on Patreon is the layers. This, I do believe, is the best way of achieving the most depth. As well as, of course, adjusting those brush strokes, the different brushes that we're using, that's just part of the process. The layering and the way that we are building up those layers is crucial. Now that's why I'd also decided to upload this on Patreon with a voiceover while I'm painting. So you'll see here that there are many times where I'm using a colour wheel under the camera so you can see exactly why I'm mixing specific colours. And I also have a palette camera in the corner of my Patreon tutorial so that members who are painting along can see exactly which colour and how much of that colour I am using for the section of fur that I'm working on. And in regards to mixing the exact colour, I personally do not focus on that at all throughout my layering process, because here you can see I'm working with glazes to adjust that colour. So during each process when I'm adding the details, I'm focusing on my values. So I'm currently using this detailed brush and I'm really focusing, do I need to add my lighter details or do I need to reinforce some shadows? I'm currently here now reinforcing my highlights. It's not the right colour, but it is bright enough, and that's what I'm really focusing on. Once that's dry, you can see here I'm adjusting that colour with a glaze. So I really do not focus on the colour throughout most parts of the layering process. It's only once I've achieved the next layer of depth and detail with that fur do I then change the colour. Now, mixing colours, knowing which colour to select, is something that can cause us a lot of anxiety when working with any colour-based medium, and that's why I really do go in depth on this aspect of every single one of my tutorials so that I can try and break down how I select my colours based on that reference photo. Now, I don't use any overly complex colour theories or anything like that. It is just a really easy way that I've learned throughout my painting process of how to simplify what I can see in that reference photo. So if colour selection is something that you do find quite challenging, because it can be very difficult to really understand which layer we should be focusing on first, then this tutorial and many of my others on Patreon might be of interest. This nose here is again a prime example of where I'm focusing on my values. This nose is starting to look three-dimensional because I'm adding many layers, but I'm focusing on my highlights and my shadows. Each layer that I add, it gets gradually brighter. I'll adjust the colour and I'll add more of my highlights. Now, because I've used this layering process, which is the same process that I've used for the fur, this nose looks three-dimensional. It looks like it's coming off of that painting, and that's not because I've got my colour right, it's because I've got my values right. The only way to build up the three-dimensional shape is the contrast. So you want your shadows dark and your highlights bright. One thing that can happen is we're a little bit worried about going too dark in case we can't brighten it up. The problem with that is, in this case with a chocolate Labrador, if we end up with that, we'll end up with a really like a pale version, so it'll look like in between a chocolate and a yellow Labrador. So we really want to avoid that happening. The wonderful thing, as I say, with acrylics is they do dry very fast if we want them to. So we can adjust and brighten those layers if we do go too dark. Now, very rarely does that actually happen because we are very conscious about going too dark. So quite often we actually need to go darker. And if that was the case, again, all I would do is work with a simple glaze. You wouldn't have to paint over that area of fur. You could just darken that with glazes. So this is again why I really do like working with Liquitex Basics, because I can adjust my contrast just as quickly as I can the colour. Now, I've mentioned a couple of times here about the fast drying time of acrylics. I love the fast drying time because it means we can progress through a painting a bit quicker than we can if we were using oils. Now, this is why I actually transferred from using oils to acrylics, because oils were my primary medium a few years ago. But I did find that the slower drying time was actually a little bit more of a hindrance, so I switched over to acrylics. Now, of course, that's going to be personal preference. There's no right or wrong medium to use, but I do find that acrylics are better suited for the way that I like to work. Now, in terms of that fast drying time, this is something that acrylics are often criticised for, but I think it's a real bonus, because we can also slow down that drying time and prevent that paint from drying at all, depending on how wet we keep that surface. So you could use a fine mist sprayer bottle and throughout various stages apply a layer of water over that painting, and that will prevent that previous layer of acrylics from drying out at all. So if we needed to, we could technically make acrylics work just in the same way as oils, and this paint could stay wet for hours. Now this would be really beneficial if we were working with a blurred bokeh background where we needed that paint to stay wet, and then we could use a blending brush to soften out those brush strokes. This again is one of the reasons why acrylics is one of my favourite mediums to work in, because it is just so versatile. Now for this painting, I didn't have to use a fine mist spray bottle and do that degree of wet on wet blending, so I haven't used that technique here. But there are many instances where you might want to mix between that technique and the techniques that I'm showing in this tutorial. It really will depend on the type of reference photo and the effect of that photograph. Now it's at this stage in the painting where I've taken a step back from my easel. I keep tilting that canvas forward, and that's so that I can see what the painting looks like without the glare from my overhead lights. You can see that the top of the head looks to have a little bit of a bluish tint, and it's just because of the lights that I'm using at the top of my easel. So throughout that process I will tilt that forward just so I can see what it's going to look like a little bit more accurately when framed on the wall. Now when it came to painting the body, I'm using the same technique in terms of building up many layers, but I'm using a different combination of brushes. So I haven't changed the brushes that I'm using, but I have taken some of them out, because I don't want the fur here on the body to have the same fine, tiny hair detail as what we've done on the face. The fur on the body, specifically with Labradors, is quite dense. It's quite a bit thicker compared to the fur on the face. So I do want to make sure that I've got a change in my brushstroke technique to replicate the difference in the fur texture. Now again, this is all covered in real time in that Patreon tutorial. Getting the difference in the fur texture for me is one of the most important things of any portrait that I work on. If I add the brush strokes that are the same to the face and the body, I will make the body of this Labrador look very similar to something like a Staffordshire Bull Terrier, where that breed has a fur length that's the same all over the body from the head right down to the tail. Whereas Labradors, as I say, they do have much more of that thicker coat along the chest and the body. So I really do want to make sure that I capture that. So I do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up, because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be really, really grateful. Here is a photograph of my finished painting, and I'm going to be uploading another video here to YouTube next week, and I do upload between 2 to 3 videos here every week, so if you would like to get notified of all of that content, don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can, and as always, thank you so much for watching.